Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a drill. This is a NOW seminar, and we try to sophisticate by bringing academic, rigorous analysis to contemporary culture without the ordinary limitations of academic scholarship. And today's topic is, why is tennis a perfect game? I'm Fred Weibull, and I'm talking to Pete Watt from York. And we've set out to discuss today's topic, why is tennis a perfect game, against the backdrop of three kind of sections and three questions. And the first one is, what is the form of tennis? How has tennis appeared in thought, or how can it be thought about? And thirdly, what is the relationship between tennis and sex, or the aesthetics of tennis? We're not, I mean, just as by means of a preface, we're not exactly the first to become interested in tennis. People have been interested in thinking specifically about tennis in high frequency, I think, compared perhaps to other sports. And when I say thinking, perhaps worthwhile saying that it's in the broadest sense of not just in the broadest sense of what thinking might mean. And there are thinkers and philosophers, for example, the Scandinavian literature professor Lars Gustafsson, the French philosopher and historian of thought Gilles Deleuze, but also it appears among writers such as Martin Amis, and also it's a kind of a popular notion among aesthetes such as Anna Wintour. So it's quite a broad phenomena to think and talk about tennis as such. We're not the first to do it.
Yeah, I mean that's the background, but in a lot of ways that's also just touching the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, on the way that tennis has been spoken about. And I imagine as we go through, we'll probably pick up on specific examples.
Yes.
And I suppose we in a way, we're starting with a thesis, aren't we? We're starting with something that we both agree on, which is that for us, tennis is the perfect game. And I suppose one of the ways that tennis is the perfect game, and how then do we think through why tennis is the perfect game?
Yeah.
Immediately, a lot of legwork has been done for us, because tennis has been, as you said, articulated in kind of philosophical and intellectual terms. I mean, there's almost a history, there's almost a literary or intellectual history of tennis. And yeah, just to add to your context, there seems to me that the moment, I mean, all sports are written about, all sports have their kind of cultural and social histories. But if you're interested in tennis, and you read up on tennis, whether you read through the autobiographies of tennis players that you admire or you like, or even if you just, tournaments and the kind of history of tournaments, there's something in tennis that lends itself to almost philosophical extraction. Would you agree?
Yes, I would, yeah.
So, I mean, a key kind of contemporary person who constantly returns to tennis is David Foster Wallace. And what's interesting about David Foster Wallace, I mean, I'd like to take issue with some of the ways he does write about tennis, but one of the interesting things about David Foster Wallace and what kind of, I suppose, speaks to our fascination is that he can't just write about tennis. It's not just the kind of banal sports journalism of this is what happened in this match.
Yeah.
Foster Wallace can't help but, in one of his most famous articles, describe tennis, Federer versus Nadal. It was the US Open final, I can't remember the year, but he describes it as a religious experience. And I think there's an element of hyperbole with David Foster Wallace, but it's not hyperbole without reason. There's something in tennis that lends itself philosophically and intellectually to thinking about it in a certain way. And as you said, that is really what we kind of want to get to the grips with. And through the three kind of focuses that we that you mentioned, which were just to repeat, form, thought, and sex.
Yeah.
So this is the way we're going to structure, aren't we? So
yes.
Do you want to say anything more by way of introduction, or do you want to start with speaking first about form?
I think that's good enough as by means of an introduction. I think a key starting point for talking about the topic in the first place is to first kind of sections. It's the question about form, and this is a direct reference to Deleuze, the French philosopher who was contemporary and a close thinker, together with the historian of systems of thought, Michel Foucault, and it's Gilles Deleuze. And he was interviewed in a program that was called, I'm not going to even try to say the French because I don't speak it, but the ABC of Gilles Deleuze. And it was a French television program that consisted of 8 hours of a series of interviews between him, Deleuze, and the journalist, as well as his former student and close friend, Claire Parnet, and you can Parnet perhaps, and you can see that there is quite a close relationship between the two. They are on very friendly, casual terms in the dialogue, and it's called the ABC because Claire Parnet, she had prepared a topic for each of the letters in the alphabet, and on the letter T, it was tennis. And I mean, this was, I believe, it seems that it's not known to Deleuze when he's asked to comment, basically, towards the end of his life and his career as a prominent thinker about the topic of the day. I mean, and I think that's also true for tennis. So when she says, and T is for tennis, it's the first time he hasn't really prepared for it, and so what comes out is quite interesting, and it's also kind of improvised. And one more thing I should say about that series is that it was released posthumously. So he was he was concerned for it. It wasn't proper formal work, which is exciting for us, I suppose. Because if Deleuze had kind of done the work for us about the form of tennis, then we might not have a job today.
Yeah, it's too short, isn't it? It's too short. Like you say, it's a really... It's about, does he speak... Because as you say, it's the A to Z, isn't it? Or the ABC of certain topics.
Yeah.
And it's about a 5-minute segment, maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes. But it's a beautiful little segment, isn't it?
It is beautiful. It was conducted and recorded in 88 to 89, but because he didn't die until 94 or 5 or something like that, it wasn't aired until 96.
Oh, so he actually... So he knew it wasn't going to be aired until after his death.
That was the deal.
Oh, I didn't realize. I didn't know any context. Of it. That's interesting.
So that was the agreement,
yeah.
and which is interesting because someone like that who is concerned with his legacy so much and doesn't want whatever he says now, unlike contemporary celebrity culture, for example. Was not so concerned, he was concerned for that not to come and interfere with the perception of him and his thinking while he was still alive. So that says something about, that perhaps he took certain air of liberty. He added a sort of a dimension or a degree of freedom. Okay. Enough by means of an introduction. What he said, or what he pointed to, was that we can think about different forms of tennis. And this, I think, is important. So we can think about different forms of tennis. And he likened that to another sport, which was, a few sports, but one that in particular was the kind of the flop style, the Fosbury flop style of high jump technique. Which was an introduction which became popular, kind of invented and then perfected in 1968 in the Olympics by a guy called Fosbury. And it's a completely new style. The form of the high jump style, it completely changed the form, and it enabled new records to be achieved. In terms of tennis, when he starts talking about the new form of tennis, he concentrates. What he's really interested in is that he's interested in the form of tennis that is before and after Björn Borg. And he says that with Björn Borg, a new kind of invention of he was a great inventor or creator of a new form of tennis. And he says that Borg is exactly like Christ, an aristocrat who goes to the people And he contrasts him to McEnroe, saying that McEnroe was a pure aristocrat, half Egyptian, half Russian, with an Egyptian service game with a Russian soul. And the democratic principle of Borg style, according to Deleuze, was back of court, twisting, ball high, and these things, of course, Björn Borg had a unique talent for delivering at the level that others couldn't. But the promise of Borg is that he could be imitated, so others could do the same thing, and that is the kind of the Christ-like metaphor. That's of Björn Borg, that he enabled others to see the potential of playing a game that could be standardized. So back at court, twisting, the service game, ball high. Unlike McEnroe, whose whole form of tennis is aristocratic, he calls it. And by that, I think it's very interesting also for us to think about what aristocracy is. But he says it is the opposite. No one can imitate it. You cannot mimic it, which is also to say that you cannot anticipate what the next move is going to be. But whereas with Borg, you can it's almost like a monkey could play like Björn Borg, but no one can anticipate or mimic McEnroe's style. The whole principle of that, which he calls aristocratic in McEnroe's style, is that it is that it cannot be mimicked, that it cannot be anticipated, that it is always advanced. It's more like a chess player who anticipates the next move and comes up with a better one, and So, and I think that contrast between the aristocratic McEnroe and the democratic Björn Borg is a very interesting starting point. And I think it's so fascinating to think about tennis in terms of form in this sense.
Exactly. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that, I mean, if you remember, I re-listened to the interview the other day, and I suppose another thing, just to kind of reiterate how we began, was that the reason why Deleuze emphasizes Borg in the way that you've explained is because it's a turning point in the history of tennis. And if we think of all sports as processes of variation in their form, both kind of the physique of the tennis players, to the technologies that they use, to the game, to the speed, to the style, to the commercialization. What he names with Borg is a turning point, as you said, he calls it the massification of tennis. And he says at another point that it's the proletarianization, I think he says. And like you said, Borg has a style that can be mimicked. And there was an interesting point, and I suppose the reason why we say that, the reason why I'm kind of reiterating the context here, is because it's easy, I think, perhaps too easy, to suggest that what you have is a French philosopher extracting things from a simple game that aren't necessarily there. But they really are. And at one point, is it Parnay? Almost laughs, and she says, there can't be a working class style of tennis. And he says, and I wrote this down, it's a very short answer. He says, well, in terms of what you said, what defines Borg's style? Back of the court, retreat, the ball is high over the net. He says any worker could understand that style. Any worker or any small manager, any kind of petit bourgeois manager can understand this kind of defensive approach to tennis. And I suppose it's important to note that the Borg was, and Deleuze emphasizes this as well, Borg was a creator as well. He was an original. Although his style can be mimicked, he was a first. He was the first, in Deleuze's words, to bring this certain massified, proletarianized style of tennis to the court. And in that sense, he is the same as McEnroe. They're both creators. But in the history of tennis, what Borg opened up was something on a more mass scale, whereas, as you said, and from Deleuze, McEnroe was pure aristocrat. What was it? Half Egyptian, half Russian, I think he says. Is that right?
Yeah.
So again, you know, you ask someone to start speaking in this informal context about tennis, and they end up with quite philosophical considerations.
I'm curious about what just one footnote to what I'm not sure exactly what it is that Deleuze means when he says half Russian, half Egyptian, half. He says, and there is McEnroe. I'm quoting, and there is McEnroe. He was pure aristocrat, half Egyptian, half Russian. Egyptian service, game, Russian soul. And what does he mean by that? I mean, he doesn't expand. And my interpretation is that the service game is his service. It's quick, and you cannot anticipate it. So when he serves, he's fast to the net, and he plays an unpredictable form of tennis. And perhaps there is something Egyptian, pharaonic here, and pre-Christian Egyptian.
Yeah.
I mean, it must be that it's.
I mean, possibly.
Almost godlike or something like that. You know, I don't know how to interpret the.
No, well, to be honest, that was a question I had for you.
But you recently watched the. You rewatched the McEnroe Borg 1981 Wimbledon final.
Yeah.
Did you do that against thinking about this kind of characterization of the forms?
Yeah, I mean, not so much to do with form. I mean, I think I can speak about that. Maybe. Well, not in relation to Deleuze, no. And to be honest, I'm not sure what Deleuze meant. He does elaborate a little bit more about the difference between the style of Borg and McEnroe.
Yeah.
And really, in a way, they're opposites. But I think.
Well, the Russian soul part is clearer. I mean, that's got to do with his outbursts.
Not to me. Can you explain?
So in the discussion that follows as well, you know, Claire Parnay says, well, what about, those are ridiculous, the McEnroe outburst, perhaps also to a French sensibility of decorum and etiquette. You know, she says, it seems ridiculous, you know. And Deleuze says, well, that's part of his style, that's part of his creativity, I suppose. I mean, I think that you would have to say that. Well, I also think that Deleuze points out that actually McEnroe is the two of them compared. McEnroe is the one with raw talent, and he says that the outbursts, the famous or infamous outbursts of McEnroe, that's part of that's part of the source of the form of his or the style of his game, and
exactly.
And it's a release. It's that which recharges the batteries or that provides it provides a clean slate or something like that. It's
Exactly. So basically, the question that she asks Deleuze is whether his outbursts are a frustration with himself.
Yes.
And he says, no, it's not. It's fully part of McEnroe's style.
It's necessary. It's a vital component. It's a vital.
Well, he says it's part of McEnroe's soul. He uses the German Gemut to say that actually the outbursts are part of his soul. So yeah. But I think it's interesting in a way. I think Deleuze was a little bit too quick to dismiss Parnay's question. I mean, I think he's right, but there is. So I've read both of McEnroe's biographies now. He's recently released a newer one, but I've got a little quote for you here, which I think you'll quite like. So I think that when Deleuze kind of dismisses it and says that it's more about the soul than a psychological outburst. McEnroe has written this, and I've got a little quote for you. So this is McEnroe's words, not ours. He says this. He says, this is in his first biography. He says, tennis is an intellectual debate. Part conversation, part attack. Preparation, training, revision are fun, but the game is only as fun so long as it is going your way. Don't be prone to psychological fluttering. It will cloud your judgment of the ball and the clarity of your argument. You are always playing yourself. Tennis as a game is always 2 against 1. Having a hit is easy. Now, they're McEnroe's words. That's McEnroe, the tennis player, putting his game into the arena that we're trying to discuss it, which is the intellectual debate. Mm-hmm. Now, if I can answer your question on, again, the difference between McEnroe and Borg, this is something that I've become fascinated by, and this is what I saw when I watched the 1981 final again. Mm-hmm. There's this constant battle in tennis for the individual tennis player between their genius or their talent and discipline. And Borg, he's not quite Federer, but he's pure discipline. He was almost, he is Christ-like. He was almost like, there was almost something kind of like a monk about the way that he'd kind of walk around the court. He'd never show any emotion. He was completely disciplined. I've heard anecdotes about, apparently he'd always start Wimbledon completely clean shaven. And it was almost like a little tick that he had where he'd never shave until after Wimbledon. So by the final, which he often got to, he would have that kind of hippie-ish, almost Christ-like look about him.
Yeah.
But then compare that to McEnroe. And McEnroe names this in this small passage where he says he's aware of the psychology in the game, but what he's more to do with raw talent and hitting the ball hard and flat over the net than he is about discipline. But I think in McEnroe what we see is more. There's something more raw about McEnroe, and he's also an aristocrat in the sense that he's a complete individual, in a sense. He's not democratic in the way that Borg is. McEnroe was never the people's champion. He always seemed to be entitled to his win. And it's interesting, on the 1981 final between Borg and McEnroe, did you notice that Lady Diana Spencer was in the crowd?
Yeah.
And I thought there was this interesting little moment that you basically had the person that would become the people's princess watching the people's champion being beaten by the aristocrat of tennis, the true aristocrat of McEnroe, destroying the democratically elected aristocrat that Deleuze names. It was this really weird kind of, art imitating life. But anyway, that was just an extraction.
Yeah.
So I think it back to your question, what does he mean by the Russian soul? Well, there's an almost anti-democratic nature to McEnroe. And it's shown both his style on the court, the way he hits the ball over the net. He hits it hard, he hits it flat, he hits it low to the net, whereas Borg retreats and is kind of, Borg is more of a diplomat.
Yeah, definitely.
So maybe that's what Deleuze is getting at. But whatever Deleuze is getting at, hopefully we can kind of see the way that style, or in particular the form of tennis, impacts or has almost a philosophical or intellectual tradition, I suppose.
I want to go back to what you said there. Thank you. That's very interesting. I thought it was interesting what you said about the turning point earlier, about Borg's invention of the kind of, what should we call it, the massification, the proletarization, the democratization maybe of tennis. It's a popular term these days to talk about the democratization of X, Y, Z, especially with startup culture and so on. But it's not just. Because what you point to when you say that is that there's a historical construction of forms of tennis that come after, and of course the nationalities are important here to some extent because the Swedish Björn Borg rising to power from very humble background, strong social democratic tendencies, and dominated Swedish politics at the time, and this became the importance of sport being kind of a political power symbolism, and Borg becoming a representative of the welfare state, and that everyone can achieve sophistication on mass scale in the progressive social democratic / socialist kind of nation power excellence. Everyone modeled their social reforms in the 70s and 80s and still do, with Saunders and in the US and Corbyn in the UK on the Swedish social democratic social welfare models, politics and economics. And so that's one part of, I think, the importance of this particular form, because it's there is an elective affinity with the form and the politics of the time. And I think that's important to make it popular. The popularization of this form, which is so accessible and trainable, people can be disciplined to become tennis players. The people can rise. The kind of undermining of this being a privileged sport, and accessible instead to the masses. The toppling or overthrowing of the old order upper class sport, really par excellence. And so I think that matters. I'd like to name it kind of politics of truth. It's something that appears in Foucault, and now that we're talking about Deleuze, we might as well talk about Foucault. But Foucault said that I'm interested in the politics of truth, and the kind of the power effects of truth, and the effects of this form being accessible as a form of truth, the aesthetics here, and everything that aesthetics make possible. I mean, the aesthetics and simply the aesthetics of the tennis game, which, when we talk about form, we should perhaps say that it's actually a question about aesthetics, the movement of bodies and the position of bodies and all that. That's if it's going to be in one of the categories, epistemology, ontology, aesthetics, ethics, or or logic, then it's going to have to be aesthetics, isn't it? And how you do these things, and that becomes transferable to some sort of technology, so that you can say the technology of the disciplined subject, or disciplining the subject in a particular way, but its basis is an aesthetic one. And so the form is an aesthetic, and the effects of this, if you look at the Swedish example, we've produced a number of tennis players. I think in proportion that is disproportionate to the size of the population of the national population. You know them. It's Stefan Edberg, it's Mats Wilander, it's contemporary with Borg, and it's Söderling. Who else is there? Those are some, and of course Mikael Panfors, and a few others. But it's been a bit of prominent tennis nation Sweden has. I don't know enough about the history of this, when courts were built en masse, but around the same time in the late 70s, I imagine, and in the early 80s, and perhaps propelled, I think in the mid 70s, this was part of kind of the health section of social welfare reform, and to build lots of tennis courts, good quality tennis courts, and along with other sports. So perhaps Björn Borg's aesthetic form of tennis is a consequence of the wider politics of sports as a political symbol, power symbol.
No, I think you're right. I think that there's certainly something to be gleaned from that. But on that note, I think this, there's something in that. There's something in. I mean, as you said, Sweden as a nation has a history of producing, a lot of tennis players, but importantly, producing tennis players from Sweden. These aren't the Swedish tennis players that go over to America to Nick Bollettieri's camp and become these quasi national figures. Like what's the name of the Russian?
Sharapova.
Sharapova. Yeah. Okay. Is Sharapova Russian?
Yeah.
Well, she might be Russian in some ways, but her development as a tennis player is an Americanization. She went to the same tennis camp in Florida that Andre Agassi did, and that Tommy Haas of Germany did, and Greg Rosetsky of Great Britain did, by way of Canada. I mean, I think it's a really important point in a way.
Nothing is more Russian today than Russians that go and become Americanized.
Yeah, but explain.
Well, it's this kind of you dream.
My question was, do I just agree with Fred and move on, or do I press him on it? I'm going to press him on it. What does he mean? Go on.
Well, the biggest dream that you can dream in former Soviet satellite states and perhaps Soviet itself is to make it big. And when you can't do that in the crumbling economy yourself, you want to chew the bubble gum, don't you? And watch Dallas.
I haven't read it, but I've read the introduction to Maria Sharapova's new biography, and I'll read you the first sentence because it actually backs up your point. She says, "In the middle of the night, a father and his daughter step off a Greyhound bus in Florida and head straight to the Nick Bollettieri Tennis Academy. They ring the bell, though no one is expecting them, and they don't speak English. They have arrived from Russia with just $700 and the conviction that the 6-year-old girl will be the world's next great tennis star. They are right." I mean, that's just the rags to riches American dream, isn't it? Really. It's yeah. But
that was a nice little footnote.
Yeah, so that's a footnote, but a footnote to back up your point, I suppose. I'd like to say one more thing about form.
Yeah.
That links to what you were saying about. Essentially, I think if I was to reduce what you were saying about Borg's style in 1981 and what Deleuze said about it, is you're saying that it's the distillation of the context from which he came. So the social democratic Sweden. Mm. There's something about tennis, the game of tennis, that. Okay, so when I was preparing for this podcast, I kept finding myself going back to football or soccer as a proxy, to kind of think through why tennis is the perfect game. Because the temptation would be to say that tennis is the beautiful game. And it is, aesthetically, it's incredibly beautiful. But it's not, it's football that's described as the beautiful game. By definition. And it made me wonder what it is about tennis that marks it out as different from football. And there's a history of people writing intellectually about football as well.
Yeah.
I mean, one writer that writes about tennis and football is Martin Amis. And I was struck by something that Martin Amis said about the World Cup in 2012, and I haven't got the direct quote in front of me, but he said something like, one of the reasons why he loves watching the World Cup is because he likes to see national stereotypes histories and bigotries being played out. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of history in football matches. There's a lot of history, you know. I mean, if you're you know, England versus Germany is the example.
Yeah.
You know, I don't really need to say anything more than that. I mean, is that really about football? Well, yes, it is. Of course, it is. But behind it is a whole history.
Yeah.
I struggle to get excited about football.
Yeah.
In the same way that I get excited about tennis. And it's for slightly different reasons. You do see national stereotypes being played out on the tennis court. But I think they're much more clearer in tennis. And the reason why they're much more clearer and therefore much more exciting and much more dramatic is because tennis is an individual sport.
Yeah.
So what you actually see in Borg, which you've just said with the social democratic context, is you actually you see his Swedish character. Now, you don't see Swedish character in football when the Swedes play football any more than you see Swedish character or English character in English football, because it's a completely different game. It's a completely different relation to the object of the sport. And so, for example, what you see in football is a team sport. Mm-hmm. So what you're really watching are different tactics and different strategies. But tennis is pure character. It's pure drama, because it's an individual. And it's an individual playing against the opponent, but also playing against themselves. Back to that kind of quote from McEnroe.
Yeah.
Tennis is always 2 against 1.
Yeah.
And this came to a head. I really wanted to mention this to you when we were preparing for the podcast, but I was very tempted to watch the new film that's out that shows that's about McEnroe and Borg. And I'd read a few reviews, and you know, it was kind of seen as apparently it was very kind of, there was a lot of emphasis on Borg rather than McEnroe and all this type of thing.
More palatable.
But, yeah, and it's a drama. It's a drama. Mm. Instead of watching that, I decided on my Friday night to watch the Wimbledon final of 1981.
Yeah.
And what struck me watching that was that actually, was I watching it for sport? Did I know the outcome? Did I know, well, you know, and it made me think that actually the difference between tennis and football is that tennis is a true drama. It's not just a sport. It is inherently literary. There's so much narrative to sport.
Yeah.
I mean, if you watch that 1981 final, it couldn't be written. It couldn't be written about. You have to watch it for what it is. It is like going to the theatre, you know, and it's because what the theatre needs is not just plot. It needs character.
Yeah.
And because tennis is an individual game, and it has individual characters, you do have that drama that you don't get. And you'll find that people have their favourite tennis player that isn't based on, like with football, you tend to support the team that you live locally to.
Yeah.
Or the team that your family have a tradition of supporting. In tennis, it's completely different. It almost defies the national origins, and it's about the character and style of...
So we've discussed the different forms of tennis, the historic forms, or at least a way of starting to unpick them. But if you ask a different question, which is also about form, but what is the fundamental form of tennis compared, for example, to other sports such as football?
Yep.
Then, I mean, pedestrian territory, perhaps. But if you take what you've just said, which is to point out that it's an individual sport and it's about character, you end up ultimately to affirming Claire Parnay's suspicion about the impossibility of naming tennis in any one way form as a democratic sport.
Say a little bit more.
Because she objected, how can you talk about tennis being democratic in any one way when Deleuze brought up the distinction? And Well, whereas there can be kind of differences in the form of tennis, like what we've described it now, in terms of the form of tennis of the individual tennis player, at the end of the day, he is still an individual tennis player who has to go out there. He doesn't have his team to rely on. It is aristocratic fundamentally in this sense. The nature, the character of tennis is fundamentally aristocratic, which is kind of, to my ears, that rings beautifully, because I quite like the impermeability of it being an aristocratic sport somehow, and that is why I enjoy watching it. And to make this slightly less pedestrian, you know, do you remember that the jargon of authenticity? I think it was Adorno, but he pointed out that there is a very fine line between metaphysics and kind of very, I can't remember what it was, you know, a very romantic kind of base impulse or something like that. But nonetheless, I'll try. So there was a distinction. There is this kind of expression that football is a game invented for gentlemen, played by thugs. Rugby is a game invented for thugs, played by gentlemen. And cricket is a game invented for gentlemen and played by gentlemen. I think that we can substitute cricket for tennis and say that it is invented for gentlemen and played by gentlemen. It's a bit like cricket in this sense. Yeah. So, and even if even if you have characters like Sharapova, who really, I think, is not really a gentlewomanly character on court in any one way. Quite cheap and disrespectful to the audience and to her opponent, kind of cheap tricks and yeah, kind of ambitious in the vulgar sense. She is not really undermining the fundamental form of tennis. So the fundamental form of tennis is aristocratic, you know.
Let me just pick you up on what you. So you like the idea. What did you say? You said the impermeability of tennis as an aristocratic sport.
Yes.
I think there's a truth to that, and this can be looked at in different ways. And I mean, one thing remains, that though you might have lots of tennis players coming from a social democratic background and nationality like Sweden, it will never be football. It will never be anyone's national sport in the way that, you know, golf is for the Scots and, you know, football is for the English.
Yeah.
It never will be. And this is for a number of different reasons. And you can talk about the political, you can talk about the economic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of talk. I mean, you know, I played a lot of tennis when I was younger, and it's very kind of middle to upper. It's a very middle to upper class sport for a number of reasons. But these reasons again come back to the individual nature of it, and the individual nature of tennis is that if you are to play tennis, you need individual equipment. To play football, you just need a ball and a couple of jumpers for goalposts. So pretty much anyone can play football. Anyone can learn to play football. Yeah. Tennis, you need racket, clothing, club membership, an individual coach, time, all the things that are the privilege of the middle and upper classes, largely, and particularly with time, more for the upper rather than the middling.
Yeah.
But again, this makes it as a proxy to football so different. And I suppose the thing is that yes, there might be democratic styles like that of Borg.
Yeah.
But that's a democratic style on the court. And remember that what Deleuze said was that he is an aristocrat bringing democracy to the people.
Yeah.
But it's bringing them to the people as spectators.
I suppose
you
so.
still have. Do you see what I mean? So
Yeah. Spectator, player, amateur, player.
yeah, exactly.
Amateur player, spectator, yeah.
Yeah, and we could speak up. Yeah, exactly.
I'd like to say a few more things. I mean, one thing is to consider perhaps, of course, I mentioned the kind of political base that might have served the kind of building courts and making accessible these, for example, courts and equipment and in the Swedish welfare state that might have enabled Borg to rise and his form and so on. And of course, there was an attempt to make it really popular at the time, a genuine one with how Borg developed his game. He just played against the wall, and anyone can do that. I mean, there were techniques in the 70s like this.
I remember an anecdote that his ball toss for his serve.
Yeah.
I'd read somewhere that he used to, like hitting the ball against the wall, he would actually...
Or the garage door.
Yeah. And there's actually footage of him doing it somewhere. I have seen it. I remember...
in a suburb to Stockholm, yeah.
Yeah. But he'd throw the ball and just let it drop. And apparently he'd do this for hours. He would literally just to get the ball at the right height for his serve. Whereas... and that can be recreated. That's him standardizing his own. That's discipline, isn't it? That's the repetition of discipline.
Yeah.
Can you imagine super brat John McEnroe having that level of discipline? I mean, of course he had discipline, and he talks about his diet changing as he got more serious, and him having earlier nights, and there is a kind of discipline. But he's still super brat. He was still, and I suppose this has a knock-on effect on the aesthetics of tennis, because Roger Federer, for me, is pure discipline in a way, and this is a reason why I would not celebrate him in the way that David Foster Wallace celebrates him.
Yes,
and I'm speaking now both philosophically, but also as a spectator of tennis. I mean, yes, okay, it's beautiful watching Roger Federer backhand, but it's almost too beautiful. It's almost too perfect, and he does play to perfection in a way, Federer.
Yes. I mean, someone said that Federer's style has changed, but yes.
So.
One thing what I wanted to say was just on technology. So, the surface matters, and I think there was a very successful salesperson in Scandinavia in the 70s and 80s that managed to get, or even in the 90s, that managed to get first clay sold into Sweden, which. Let's think about it. Actually, is quite remarkable, because where would you like to play clay? Well, outdoors to begin with.
Southern Europe.
Southern Europe, Spain, southern France, Italy.
Yeah.
Why would you play
Portugal?
Why would you want to play in Sweden or Denmark or I suspect Norway and also Finland on clay?
I mean, I was surprised when I went
remarkable.
to.
You don't have that, and what you don't have is in the UK clay courts. And for this to be the origin of tennis, the green sport, which by the way was invented in Leamington Spa by a Birmingham business person in 1870s, 80s, something like that.
Okay.
I mean, with the contemporary length of the court and the height of the net. There is a hotel near the railway station in Leamington Spa, where it was first played and invented, and it's the oldest tennis club is the Leamington Spa lawn tennis club.
Okay,
but they still have clay, grass courts, but they have some sort of fake grass courts. So. There
Can I ask, Fred?
Yeah.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? Who was the first person to win all 4 Grand Slams?
I don't know.
Can you remember? I
No.
genuinely don't know. I'm asking.
I don't know.
Because I wonder if it was Borg.
Yeah, maybe it was.
But the reason why I'm asking again is that with the types of court, that is traditionally central to the nation and the climate of the nation in which the player. So you'd have people that could only really play on grass courts.
Yeah.
So can you remember Pat Rafter, for example?
Or Nadal is a typical clay court player.
But he can play grass. Whereas, and this is because of technology, this is why I wanted to bring it in, because the technology of the rackets has changed, the technology of the humans have changed. I mean, if you look at the size of even Andy Murray, you know, Andy Murray is an absolute, I mean, he's so muscular, he's so strong.
Yeah.
Even compared to someone like Federer or Djokovic. But especially if you look at the, you know, I mean, I said 1981. You look at the physique of Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe.
Yeah.
And they're boyish. They really are boyish.
Lanky.
And they're lanky. But the reason why I say this is because there has been a change, and it's a homogenizing change to tennis. That you used to get the all-rounder, and I wonder if it was Borg. And this might be because he has a democratic style on a very kind of provincial surface, which is the Southern European surface.
Yeah.
But what you've got to remember, and I remember this when I was playing tennis, and I used to obsessively watch tennis, and I used to love watching clay court tennis actually, and it was because it's such a slower surface. You'd get tennis players with really they were called, I don't know if it's the same in Swedish, but they were called Eastern grips. So you'd hold the racket right round underneath, and they'd hit with a lot of topspin. Whereas obviously grass, because it's a low bouncing ball, you can hit it harder and flatter. So you'd have a full Western grip or a half Western grip.
Yeah.
And but that obviously the grip of the racket was adapted to the type of surface. And if you were brought up, Tim Henman, for example, playing lawn tennis in the true sense of on grass.
That's true.
Henman would be knocked. He'd come away from being knocked out of the first round of the French Open.
Yeah.
And then get through to the semi-finals of Wimbledon, and that's because of him being an English tennis player, I suppose.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, yeah. But I just think that perhaps it's worth mentioning that if you want to think about the form of tennis, that's strongly related to the technology, such as, you know, what surface is it played on, what is the nature of the rackets, is it indoor, is it outdoor? The sensation of playing outdoors is different because of the sense of perspective of the ball. If you have a roof, for example, compared to not having a roof, that matters. So the form, I mean, it almost becomes an actor network kind of theory, science and technology studies type of way of approaching what is the form of tennis. Well, I don't want to get too much into that, but I just want to point it out. I think that what we've covered so far is kind of topic 1 and 2, and that is what is the form of tennis, and how can we think about tennis? And to just wrap things up there, a few things that might be worth mentioning is, you know, what are the consequences of well, maybe not so much more about the consequences, but I'm just thinking about when you and I have discussed who are we impressed with on the court, we're always interested in I would say, which one out of those two is it, the aristocratic or the democratic? It's certainly always the aristocratic. And if I go through some of the prominent tennis players since the 1980s, because when Deleuze was interviewed was in 1988, and that's a while back, right? You know, that's now 30 years ago, and almost. And a lot has happened since. But if I mention Andre Agassi, aristocratic or democratic?
Oh, you want me to
name?
Okay. it's difficult to be quick because I need to think about that whole style.
And Agassi, I would say aristocratic.
I'd say halfway, but okay.
Okay, but
Yeah.
there is an aspect that is a kind of a...
Okay, try me. I'll see what I can do.
Serena Williams.
Aristocratic.
Why?
Because, well, just her general kind of play is we'll use if we. I'm sticking with Deleuze and McEnroe as the ideal.
Yeah.
Hard hitting, original. It's based a lot on her physical presence on the court. You can't really. You have to be her size and build to play the way that she plays.
Yeah.
She plays a very specific, undemocratic game. Yeah, I'd say aristocratic for Serena.
Pete Sampras.
Democratic, definitely.
Except that he's a serve-volley type of character.
He is. However, if you look, when I think of Sampras, I think of him at the camera side serving like that, and that outline is the epitome of like the ATP Tour brand. He really was for a time the archetypal, repeatable genius of tennis for about a decade. So definitely democratic Sampras.
I agree with you. Here we go. Goran Ivanisevic.
I say aristocratic.
I would say so too. I would say Marat Safin is the same.
Yeah.
And
For the same reason. Yeah.
What about, what's his first name? Del Potro.
Juan
Del Potro. These three figures, Goran Ivanisevic, Marat Safin, Del Potro.
All my favourites, actually, in a way.
Well, this brings the point to a close, that perhaps that the aristocratic form of tennis, which ultimately is fundamentally aristocratic in its nature, why would one have, it's only girls that like Federer sort of thing. Sorry. So pedestrian. But okay.
Girls and socialists.
All right, whatever. But, if you have a true passion for players of tennis, I don't know, I dare say this, but perhaps it is the type of character that is closest to the nature of the fundamental form of the game, and that is aristocratic, and those figures bring it home. And what is so remarkable about someone like Goran Ivanisevic, it kind of comes in as a wild card and wins.
And that was a great final.
That was an excellent. I mean, it's such a story. The will to power expressed in that the character of that, the spirit of that character. Unlike his kind of countryman, who's also Croatian, is he? Yeah, Djokovic. No,
Djokovic isn't Croatian.
No, okay,
he's Serbian.
Okay. And Marat Safin also, that's Russian soul through and through. And Del Potro, I mean, that's heroic almost. I mean,
well, I think it's important to note that Del Potro was really the first time that we started speaking about tennis in philosophical terms.
That's
when
true.
He was playing. We were both watching him play. Was it at Wimbledon?
Certainly.
I don't think it was. Pardon?
It was, yeah.
But he basically, it was. I can't even remember who he was playing against, but it really was.
I don't know.
It really was a drama to watch, and he almost came across as a. I mean, the amount of self-overcoming in that match was just incredible.
There is that, yeah.
And since that match, Del Potro for me, I have no idea about his character off the court or anything like that, but just that match, that drama that we watched, the kind of tragic heroism that he exhibited was unbelievable.
But that's, in a sense, that is why do we prefer that aspect compared to perhaps what can be contrasted as the machine metaphor, the machine.
You've answered it with the question. It can't be repeated. It's a one-off. It's true character. It's true individualism, I suppose.
Yes.
It's true individual character and style and comportment.
So if we want to be unfair, but to make the point, it's the machine type player, the democratic player, is more of a coward, or there's not so much self-overcoming involved.
Yeah. I mean, maybe cowardly is a little harsh.
It's a bit too harsh. I'm sorry. It's the third time.
Maybe instead of cowardly, it's defensive.
Yes, it's a bit more
self. You know what it is? It's self-preservation. Safe. Yeah.
Yes, and actually you can see that. Well, let's not dwell on this anymore. I think we made that point. Right. So tennis and thought. I think the one thing that I'd like to say about this is that there is a book called The Tennis Players that is written in 1974 by one of the most prolific writers in Swedish since Strindberg, actually, but not known as such very much. He's also a Strindberg professor. He's a literary scholar called Lars Gustafsson. And he visited the Austin, Texas University in mid-1970s, and he wrote a book based on his trip there, which is kind of part biographical, but it's fictional. And it's called The Tennis Players, and it's first written in Swedish and then translated. And 1974, and some of the chapter titles there, it's hard to get hold of these days, but some of the titles are Siegfried's Rhine Travel, A Few Clouds on My My Sky, Backhand Down the Line, and Ragnarök, the kind of Icelandic saga notion of the Viking mythological incarnation of the first act. And one chapter is called Nietzsche versus Wagner, and A Few Gods Descend Out of the Machine. And this is kind of, I just want to provide this as a teaser. We can explore it further later on. But one thing that he comments on in that is tennis, the tennis serve as the most difficult thing in the world, because so many things have to come together all at once. So I think that's a nice way, and that is kind of thinking hard about the tennis and what tennis is. So tennis and thought, and I think that the tennis serve in this regard, that you have to toss it up, you have to hit that an exact precise moment in time. You can't wait around like golf. You can't just wait. The ball will lie there until you hit it. You have to hit it at a particular moment in time, and it's the coordination of the whole. It's a movement that is that involves many body parts, and there is the wind to consider, and that kind of characterization, I think, can be extended to the whole game. So the ball will come to you, over to your court, and if you don't hit it, it will go past you. You're going to have to hit it there, and then you have only one shot, so quite literally. And that sets it apart from other sports, such as football. You can always run after it, or I suppose you can, but it's the speed of the ball makes it impossible for you to do that. You can't just run after it. Floorball or hockey or other sports like that, it sets it apart. Okay, well, what about the rackets? The other kind of 3 or 4 racket sports, where there is badminton, there is table tennis, there is squash, and perhaps a few others. Perhaps you can also compare it to baseball, bat sport, I don't know, and perhaps cricket. But I don't know why. I mean, if we take badminton, I don't know why it's so much more attracted to my. It's got to do with the speed and also the combination of power and athleticism. I think it's got perfect composition of the court.
I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn because I've never paid attention to or played badminton in the way that I grew up playing tennis. But the serve in badminton does not set the tone for the point in the same way that it does for tennis.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to what we were saying about what we admire in the certain the attacking aristocratic style of some of our favourite tennis players. I don't know whether you've had this in playing tennis competitively, but I can remember this one match that I played where the person I was playing against was incredibly defensive. And they would just get the ball back.
Yeah.
They would constantly get the ball back. And they never dictated the nature of the points or the games.
Yeah.
And I remember in this match really struggling against this player because basically they were making me commit unforced errors. That was their whole kind of method. So they were defensive and they were forcing me to get frustrated and to make mistakes, which I was doing. And I remember this really vividly. I was probably about 14, 15. but I remember thinking that what I needed to do was set the pace for each shot, if this makes sense. So because he was going to be returning every single shot, that was his aim, just to get it back in the court. Every shot that I had to hit would essentially be a new shot.
Playing it safe, yeah.
And in a way, that's what the serve is all the time. It sets the pace for the rally or the point.
You set the pace. And in a sense, these players are often at tennis. I've been in a few different countries and played in different kind of club settings. And these players are always derogatively referred to. You know, the kind of safe players. The most prominent out of them recently, what's that Russian player that just hits the ball back, but it's so boring to watch him that you just fall asleep. Well, I can't remember his name now. It'll come to me. But that player. I mean, so if you have a spectrum of the safe player against the player that sets it all at once, you know, that is prepared to risk it all on one exceptional shot. I think that is part of the beauty of the sport as well. And the closer you get to mastering the really difficult shot, the closer you are to the ideal which is possible in the game of that.
And game. you have to when you serve. And if you think about the first and the second serve, you know, I mean, the first serve is you've always got that safety net of the second serve, but
exactly. But you know what happens if you only have one? You know racquetball, where you have badminton, squash, table tennis, and tennis. There's competitions in this, and they count it in a particular way. But in that, you only have one serve, and what happens then is that they play it very safely. So to watch racquetball players to play tennis, and I suspect the other three sports as well, they play extremely safe. And to play against those players, it's soul destroying. It's playing against a machine that will wear you thin.
Yeah, and what you would do is I did that when I was in practice, where we'd have, you know, one serve sets where you wouldn't have a second serve. And immediately what you'd do is you'd play to your second serve to make sure that the point would commence.
Yeah. Anyone who tries to just get the serve in, ultimately you can just hit it from underneath an exceptional, you know, but we'll know that there is such a thing as, I think it's called rubber arm. Something like that. It means that you become so anxious and nervous about getting it in that it manifests itself in the kind of neurology.
I recognise it. I've had it. Everyone's had it.
It's often tennis coaches say commit to the shot, which means that you hit through, including the service game. So you've got to forget so much when you play tennis. You've got to forget and overcome so much. So that's interesting. Now, relatedly, the relationship between tennis and sex, and Can we move into that?
Yeah.
First thing that comes to mind for me when I hear tennis and sex, well, two things. One is something that my coach used to tell me, or he told me once, and I don't know. I mean, it's really an accidental type of comment, but he said, it is sexy. The fact that a girl plays tennis is sexy. She doesn't have to necessarily be sexy in and of herself, but the act or commitment to the activity of being a tennis player is sexy. So it's sexy to think of a girl, and I suppose it can be extended to a boy. I don't know.
Can I come in on there just to kind of
go on?
Because I've got a nice quote for you.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know who your coach was, but I take it he wasn't Nabokov, because Nabokov wrote of, quote, an indescribable itch of rapture that can come from watching a woman play tennis.
Nabokov, the Lolita writer.
Yeah.
Okay, don't compare my tennis coach to him.
But there you go. So again, you know, there's this, the literary explains. So there is we're not just saying, yeah, tennis and sex. There is something aesthetic. It links to this. Anyway, I interrupted you. Sorry.
Second thing is, it's an iconic photograph, which is taken in 1976. Can you think which one I have in mind?
Yeah.
The tennis girl.
Yeah, it's called The Tennis Girl, isn't it?
It's called Tennis Girl, and I don't know about but yeah, and it's kind of a pop iconic picture taken by Martin Elliott, and it shows a young woman from behind like this one.
Yeah. Yeah, it was taken in Edgbaston, wasn't it?
Yeah. And yeah. I don't know about that, but
well, I do.
She's not. Yeah, you remember it. And she's approaching the net, and she is wearing a white dress. And
she's exposing her left buttock, isn't she?
And she's showing that she's not wearing any underwear. And well, this is 1976, and 1974. That book by Lars Gustafsson came out. And when is Björn Borg rising to fame? I mean, it's slightly after that, isn't it? So there is stuff going on there that I think is important for us to consider. What happened in the 70s? I think that's something for us to consider in the future. But yeah, so... and well, that picture says something that is so... That's interesting. Perhaps it says something about the 70s and its relationship to. But
I think you're right. I think there's something in that picture, and of course, I mean, I don't know how far I go into this, but I mean, tennis clubs are the sites of all sorts of sexual philandering. I mean,
are you joking?
No, genuinely. I mean,
philandering.
No, they are. Yeah. I mean, I remember growing up, and the affairs that were going on in tennis clubs were insane, based on lots of different things. But I think a key element is that there is something in tennis, and this is really partially baked, what I'm about to say, but there is something. Well, you have in tennis, you have the closest that you get to the team aspect of tennis is doubles. We've only spoken about singles so far.
Yeah.
And in tennis, a completely different game or a different aspect of tennis is mixed doubles as well. And in mixed doubles, both when men are playing against women, it's the only time that men play against women, but they're also playing with women. There is a similar, and we spoke about the gentlemanly conduct earlier, there's a similar aspect of etiquette and defense and play and support, and there's a lot going on in doubles, in mixed doubles.
Mixed doubles is the metaphor of sexual conduct.
Well, I'm using the word sex very loosely.
Okay.
In the same way that picture, I mean, it's only sexual in certain ways. It's not, this is a woman playing tennis. It's cheeky, but is it sexual? Yeah, it kind of is, but it's not overtly sexual. But there are these kind of undertones of sex going on, particularly in tennis. And it goes back to the style of watching women play tennis. And so there is something to.
What philandering was going on at your club? If you don't mind me asking.
Well, people would hook up. That's what would happen. You'd end up with mixed doubles players having affairs, coaches having affairs with the parents of. It would happen. Maybe I was just in a particularly. A club that was particularly rife for it, but it went on. But also, Fred, you see it on the professional circuit as well. You see relationships that are built up around the court and around the tour. And likewise, kind of just one more thing as well, just to say, McEnroe is an incredibly rock and roll tennis player. He's the super brat. And in his biography, he also talks about how promiscuous a lot of the players were when they were on the tour. Yeah. Not just with the other players, but also the partying that would go on. And it makes it sound like you could be reading the biography of the Rolling Stones. The only difference is he had a racket over a guitar in a lot of situations.
Yes.
And
that's the perfect tennis player as a perfect spouse, and the hills are alive and to the sound of tennis.
Yeah. Do you see what I'm getting at, though? I think there is something to that. There's something in court conduct, and
the courtly conduct of the court,
or the courtly. Yeah, the word court is also it's a term of.
The courtesans of the. Okay.
No, I was thinking more the act of dating someone is also called courting as well.
Yeah, that's true.
But as I said, this is very half baked. So
that's very. Let me carry on while we're on the half baking bandwagon. So, how about this? When Borg, McEnroe were in their prime and partying, it was always Bjorn Borg who was the main attention in terms. He gained, he was the sex symbol between the two of them. If there was one, he was the one. He was certainly more popular among the ladies.
Was he promiscuous? Do you know?
God knows. Probably not. He's Swedish. He's prude. Of course he was. He was with the, I don't know. But I know that McEnroe is slightly jealous. I've heard interviews where he's like, well, what do I have to do then if number 2 in the world won't do it among the girls? So that sort of thing, and kind of jealously pointing at Borg, who's like, how can he get all the women? There was something attractive about this kind of quiet Nordic, typical Swede.
Does sex come up in Gustafsson's novel?
No, not really. He's a bit dry, I think, as a character. But yeah. Well, okay. So,
do you want to?
No, I don't really want to say what I was going to say. So, but. One thing, there is another aspect to tennis and sex, and that is that it's kind of has kind of a fashion connection. Vanity Fair recently, Pippa Middleton has been writing a few. I think 2016 she wrote, or 2015 maybe even, she wrote about 4 quintessentially British sports, and one of them was tennis. And there is a glamour aspect to tennis, and if you want to turn up anywhere, it's a good idea to turn up at Wimbledon, especially the semifinals and the finals, dressed in a chic dress. Anna Wintour
Yep.
sits there often. Anna Wintour's favorite sport is tennis. You keep seeing it in popular culture as well. There is a famous television series called Arrested Development, where the kind of the posh trophy wife-ish mother who doesn't care about her children but cares a lot about her booze and her image and her glamour status. She's imprisoned for. She takes the hit for the family for fraud, and she's in a kind of luxury prison and where they play tennis, and you know, there's a fashion appeal to tennis. There is an aesthetic. It's like an accessory. If there's going to be one activity you can have. Tennis is a sexy thing. I also think that if there is one, it's kind of, if it's a summer sport or indoor sport, the British sport school system is very much kind of seasonal, and if there is an equivalent to it in the winters, if tennis is a summer seasonal sport, then skiing is the winter equivalent. I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there.
Well, no, and but I think as well. I mean, if you think of Wimbledon as the epitome of the kind of stylized event. I mean, if you think, when you watch a final of Wimbledon, there's a lot of people watching, isn't there? You know, in the royal boxes, you have all sorts of celebrities and style icons who are always, dressed incredibly well. So there's the kind of stylistic and sexual aspect there, but also. Alongside the sport, when you think of Wimbledon, the other tropes that you have are strawberries and cream, champagne, which are, they could be taken out of, in terms of the cliche, they could be taken from a Valentine's Day dinner. That type of they're sexually charged tropes. Champagne is a sexual, the whole shape of the bottle. Everything about it, as well as strawberries and cream as well. I mean, I'm not making this shit up. There's a truth to this, that these tropes transfer from the style of tennis and Wimbledon at its highest point in the season to other things. I mean, as I say, there's much more that could be read into this. And as I say, I read that quote from Nabokov out of context. I think it'd be interesting to pursue what these latent themes and tropes are and why they are there. But maybe that's something that we can develop further. At a later date, maybe.
So by means of summarizing, I'd like to. Is that one of the things that you'd like to develop further?
So I've it's one of those. And we've spoken about lots of different aspects. But I think moving forward, because I suppose that's something that we maybe should have caveated the podcast at the beginning with, was that this is very much a first thought on the topic of tennis.
Fleshing it out, laying it out.
And there's something that we haven't spoken about much, but you did hint at one point, because you mentioned startup culture. And something that Deleuze, who we started with, spoke about was the way that McEnroe and Borg are creatives. He uses the word creators. And what they're really doing is they're innovating on an ideal.
He even says that word, inventions of tennis.
Exactly, and that is the entrepreneurial process. So I think that without vulgarizing it, tennis is a history of creation and creativity and innovation. So we could actually look at it further through the lens of a kind of entrepreneurial history.
Tennis has a history of creation. That's one theme to take further.
Another aspect that you mentioned about the we didn't actually conclude, but. The aristocratic ideal, I mean, we named it as an aristocratic ideal, but if we take one of the key philosophers of the aristocratic ideal, who was Nietzsche, and we look at tennis matches as drama and life, Nietzsche in a summary of the aristocratic ideal, said that the aristocratic ideal is a life lived in a continual state of warfare and combat. So no defense, constant, self-overcoming and combat. And I think that's a key thing. If we were to really articulate why it is.
What's the reference for that, the aristocratic ideal quotation?
I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah, likely.
I'll source the actual quote for you. Something that I'd personally like to do is take issue with David Foster Wallace's. Because I think that he's got a weird onus on this topic, which I'd like to take and develop more. And finally, what I'd really like to do is write a literary history of tennis. I'd really like to bring together all the literary references into some kind of comprehensive review, which would be a really nice and fun gesture.
Yeah, I quite like that.
So they're my three kind of things. So the entrepreneurial, the aristocratic, four things. The entrepreneurial, the aristocratic, the David Foster Wallace, and the literary. There are my four further initiatives that I'd be keen on developing.
That's excellent. I think that they're all very good, and I think that we can work on them. I'd like to end with a quotation from Martin Amis.
Okay.
And he says, "Tennis, the most perfect combination of athleticism, artistry, power, style, and wit. A beautiful game, but one so remorselessly travestied by the passage of time." Thanks for today.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was fun. Are we done? And also, do you notice as well, I didn't bring this up, keep recording it, but Martin Amis says, beautiful game. Not the beautiful game. And David Foster Wallace describes it as his beautiful game. So that individual relation, it's not the football for the masses, it's individual. And again, it's just that theme that kind of comes through. So,
of course, it's a game. It's not a sport.
Yeah, we could take that further as well.
Yeah. Oh, I enjoyed that. Thanks, Pete.
Cheers.